June 4, 1942. 0600 hours. Pearl Harbor Fleet Operations Center. It's pre-dawn darkness. The room smells like cigarette smoke and strong coffee. 24 men in naval uniforms stand frozen around a large tactical map. The map shows the Pacific Ocean, the Hawaiian Islands, tiny dots representing ships, arrows showing predicted movements. Admiral Chester Nimitz walks into the room. He's not tall. He's not loud. He's not the kind of man you'd notice if you passed him on the street. But everyone in that room stops talking immediately when he enters. Because in the next 4 minutes, Admiral Nimitz will make a decision that will determine whether America wins or loses the entire Pacific War. In front of him, 3 radio operators sitting at their stations, fingers hovering over telegraph keys, waiting for orders. In his hand, a piece of paper with coordinates. A calculation. A prediction so specific it seems almost insane. One of his senior officers steps forward. He looks exhausted. Worried. "Sir," the officer says, "we're not certain about the target location. The intelligence from Pearl is saying one thing. Washington is saying something different. We have 3 carriers here. Damaged carriers. If we send them to the wrong location..." He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. If Nimitz is wrong, those 3 carriers are gone. Sunk. America loses the Pacific. If Nimitz is right, those 3 carriers are positioned perfectly to destroy the entire Japanese carrier fleet. Nimitz looks at the map. He looks at the coordinates. He looks at the officer. "Send the task force to Point Luck." Point Luck. A location 300 miles north of Midway Atoll. An empty stretch of ocean where, according to the intelligence, the Japanese fleet will arrive in exactly 5 hours and 23 minutes. The officer hesitates. "Sir, are you certain?" Nimitz turns to him. His face is calm. Steady. As certain as intelligence allows. And that's when everything... Because what almost nobody realizes is this: Nimitz didn't have better luck that morning. He had something far more valuable. He had information that the enemy didn't know he had. He had access to their secrets. And he was about to prove that one man's willingness to trust that advantage, when everyone else said it was impossible, can alter the course of an entire war. You clicked the right video. This isn't a story about brave pilots or dramatic dogfights. This isn't about tactical heroics or last-minute saves. This is about something much stranger. Something that most people don't understand about how wars are actually won. It's the story of how Admiral Chester Nimitz had access to something the enemy didn't even know existed. And how he was willing to act on that advantage when trusted people in his own military told him he was gambling with impossible odds. The Japanese Navy in 1942 was theoretically superior to the American Navy in almost every measurable way. They had more battleships, more experience, better trained pilots, ships that were faster, more maneuverable, better armored. On paper, Japan should have won the Pacific War. But they were operating blind. And Nimitz wasn't. Here's the question that makes this story important: how did Nimitz know what the Japanese were going to do before the Japanese even decided to do it? How did he position his fleet in the exact right location at the exact right time? How did he have the confidence to commit all of America's remaining carriers to a battle that was based on decoded enemy messages that Washington still didn't fully trust? The answer to that question is the story of the greatest intelligence advantage ever obtained in naval warfare. And it's a story that changed not just the Pacific War, but the entire nature of how modern militaries think about information, advantage, and command decision-making. By the end of this video, you'll understand the exact mechanism of how Nimitz knew. And you'll understand why that knowledge mattered more than anything else that happened that day. To understand why Nimitz's decision was so consequential, you need to understand the situation he inherited. 7 months earlier. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. At 0800 hours that morning, Japanese aircraft descended on the American Pacific Fleet with no warning. No declaration of war. No negotiation. Just sudden, overwhelming violence. The first wave hit the battleships. The USS Arizona took a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb through her deck. It penetrated 8 compartments. It detonated in the ammunition magazine. The explosion was so massive that the entire forward section of the ship was obliterated. Over 1,100 sailors died in seconds. Many of them were still below decks when the ship rolled over and sank. The USS Oklahoma had 7 torpedo hits. 7. Each torpedo tore a hole in her hull. She capsized so quickly that some of the crew was trapped inside, hammering on the hull, trying to find a way out. There was none. The USS West Virginia took 6 torpedoes and 2 bomb hits. She sank in the shallow water at the harbor. The USS California. The USS Tennessee. The USS Maryland. All damaged. All sunk or crippled. When the smoke cleared, actually cleared, not just the metaphorical smoke, but the literal smoke that hung over Pearl Harbor for days, the American Pacific Fleet's battleship force was destroyed. Nearly 1,200 sailors were dead. 50 ships were damaged or sunk. The entire foundation of American naval power in the Pacific was at the bottom of the harbor. The conventional wisdom of the time, the doctrine that the Navy had believed in for decades, was that battleships were the center of naval power. Big guns. Heavy armor. Massive firepower. That's what won naval battles. Now all the battleships were gone. The American Navy had one asset left that could actually fight the Japanese Navy, aircraft carriers. And they only had 2. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet. That was it. 2 carriers against Japan's for fleet carriers, which were led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a combat veteran who had already proven he could dominate the Pacific. By May 1942, Nagumo had swept through the Pacific like a storm. He'd attacked Ceylon. He'd sunk British ships. He'd threatened Australia. His carriers were fast, well-coordinated, and their pilots were experienced veterans. Nagumo believed Japan had the capability to destroy whatever was left of the American Navy. And if he did, if he sank the remaining American carriers, then Yamamoto's plan would work. The plan was called Operation MI. MI stood for Midway. Yamamoto wanted to attack Midway Atoll, a tiny American base 1,200 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. 2 small islands in the middle of the Pacific. Almost nothing strategically valuable except that it was close enough to Hawaii to pose a threat. But Yamamoto's real objective wasn't Midway. It was to destroy whatever remained of the American carrier fleet. The Japanese reasoning was, if you can eliminate the carriers, you eliminate American naval power. If you eliminate American naval power, America has to negotiate for peace. If America negotiates for peace, Japan wins the war. It was a reasonable plan. And Yamamoto nearly had the capability to execute it. But there was one thing Yamamoto didn't know. One thing that would change everything. In a basement beneath Pearl Harbor, in a small office with a nondescript door and no markings, there was a room that officially didn't exist. If you walked past it, you wouldn't think anything of it. No guards at the entrance. No obvious security. Just a standard Navy office door that could be any administrative section in any military installation. But what happened inside that room was the most consequential intelligence operation of the entire Pacific War. This was Station HYPO. About 30 men, cryptographers, linguists, mathematicians, intelligence analysts, worked in this basement room. They worked long hours. They worked under intense pressure. They worked on a problem that was supposed to be unsolvable. The Japanese Navy used an encryption system called JN-25B. JN-25B was complex. It was layered. It used a combination of additive tables, substitution ciphers, and random key additions. It was, by the standards of 1942, extremely sophisticated. In theory, it was unbreakable. The US Navy believed it was unbreakable. The Japanese believed it was unbreakable. But the team at Station HYPO, led by a commander named Joseph Rochefort, didn't believe anything was unbreakable. Rochefort was a peculiar man. He was methodical. He was patient. He understood both cryptography and Japanese culture and psychology. He had a clarity of mind that most people didn't have. And he had something else: he was willing to try approaches that other intelligence officers thought were crazy. By April 1942, Rochefort's team had made a breakthrough. They had gotten so good at breaking JN-25B that when the Japanese Navy sent an encrypted message to one of their task forces, Rochefort's team could intercept it, decrypt it, and translate it into English within hours. Sometimes within hours. Think about what that means. The Japanese would send a message in their supposedly unbreakable code. Rochefort would read it before the Japanese Navy even knew their code was being read. Rochefort would know Japanese operational plans before the Japanese admirals had fully committed to executing them. In May 1942, Station HYPO intercepted a stream of Japanese messages that indicated something massive was being planned. Multiple Japanese messages referenced something coded as KF. AF. 2 letters. That was all they had. The Japanese were planning to attack something designated AF. There would be 4 Japanese fleet carriers. Dozens of support ships. It would be the largest Japanese naval operation since Pearl Harbor. But where was AF? Rochefort's team analyzed the message traffic. They looked at the pattern of messages. They tracked references to distance, timing, supply requirements. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Atoll. It had to be Midway. But when Rochefort presented this analysis to naval intelligence in Washington, the response was skeptical. Captain John Redman, the head of naval intelligence in Washington, wasn't convinced. Maybe AF was Port Moresby, he said. Maybe it was New Caledonia. Maybe it was even Hawaii again. The evidence was fragmentary. The inference was risky. Rochefort's analysis wasn't official yet. It wasn't proven. It was an assessment based on decoded messages that Rochefort had faith in, but Washington wasn't sure they should trust. And committing naval forces based on unproven intelligence analysis was how commanders lost their careers. That's when Rochefort did something that intelligence officers almost never do. He decided to prove his own intelligence was correct. Rochefort knew that proving AF was Midway required more than just analysis. He needed confirmation. Hard evidence. Something that couldn't be disputed. And he had an idea that was so simple and so elegant that it was almost absurd. Rochefort knew that Midway had an infrastructure problem. Like every military base in the middle of the Pacific, Midway needed fresh water. The base was powered by salt water evaporators, machines that converted seawater into drinking water. These evaporators occasionally broke down. Maintenance was required. Supplies had to be brought in from Hawaii. So Rochefort's team sent a secure message to the commander at Midway. They told him, "Send an unencrypted radio message saying your fresh water evaporators are broken. Broadcast it in the clear. Don't encrypt it. Let anyone listening hear it." It was a test. A trap disguised as an operational message. The commander at Midway was confused. Why would they want him to broadcast a message about broken equipment in the clear? That seemed like a security violation. But the order came from Pearl Harbor. So he complied. The commander at Midway sent an unencrypted radio transmission. Fresh water evaporators malfunctioning. Request additional fresh water supplies be sent immediately. It was broadcast on open radio. Anyone with a receiver could hear it. The Japanese could hear it. And here's what happened next. 2 days later, Rochefort's code breakers intercepted a Japanese radio transmission in JN25B code. They decrypted it. It said, AF is reporting a serious shortage of fresh water. We will need to bring additional water supplies to support the operation. That's not circumstantial evidence. That's not inference or interpretation. That's proof. The Japanese had picked up the fake message about Midway's broken water evaporators. They had recognized it as intelligence about the target location. And they had confirmed, inadvertently, over the radio, in their supposedly unbreakable code, that AF was definitely Midway. Rochefort brought this confirmation to Admiral Nimitz' intelligence officer, a lieutenant commander named Edwin Layton. Layton and Rochefort were friends. They had known each other for years. They had both served in Japan. They had both studied Japanese language and culture. They understood things about Japan that most American officers didn't. When Rochefort showed Layton the intercepts, the fake message about water, the Japanese response confirming Midway, Layton believed him completely. There was no doubt. AF was Midway. And Layton brought that intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. But now Nimitz faced a dilemma that was even more difficult than the intelligence analysis. Because Nimitz had information, yes. But information alone doesn't win wars. What matters is what you do with the information. Nimitz knew that the Japanese were planning to attack Midway. But he also knew something the Japanese didn't. He knew that the Americans knew about it. The Japanese believed their code was secure. They believed their communications were encrypted and unreadable. They believed the Americans had no idea what Operation MI was. They had no conception that Rochefort was sitting in a basement reading their messages. Yamamoto was planning his operation under the assumption of complete secrecy. Nimitz, by contrast, knew everything. But that knowledge came with a decision that could destroy his career. If Nimitz committed his carriers to defend Midway based on decoded enemy messages, and if those decoded messages turned out to be wrong, then he would lose all 3 remaining American carriers in one catastrophic battle. The American Navy would be finished. And Nimitz would be blamed for gambling with the nation's naval power and losing. On the other hand, if Nimitz didn't commit his carriers, if he didn't act on the intelligence, then the Japanese would attack Midway unopposed. They would destroy the base. They would consolidate their position in the Pacific. And eventually, they would attack Hawaii and invade the American mainland. There was no middle ground. It was a bet everything moment. And Nimitz had to decide whether to believe Rochefort's intelligence or whether to play it safe and wait for confirmation from Washington. Nimitz looked at the intelligence. He looked at the confirmation trap. He looked at the analysis. Then he made his decision. He believed Rochefort. He believed Layton. Layton and Rochefort's team analyzed the decoded Japanese messages with even more precision. They looked at references to sailing times. They calculated distances. They factored in Japanese ship speeds. And they came up with a prediction. On May 27th, Layton presented this prediction to Admiral Nimitz and the Pacific Fleet staff. He stood in front of the war room map, surrounded by senior officers, and he said, "The Japanese carriers will attack on the morning of June 4th. They will approach from the northwest. The bearing will be approximately 325 degrees. At approximately 0700 hours local time, they can be sighted at about 175 miles from Midway. 0700 hours. 175 miles out. bearing 325 degrees. That's not vague. That's not somewhere around or probably in this area. That's specific. That's a prediction that could be completely wrong or completely right, with almost nothing in between. When Nimitz heard Layton's prediction, he understood what Layton was claiming: we can tell you not just where the Japanese fleet will be, but when they'll be there and what direction they'll be coming from. That level of specificity seems almost insane. If Rochefort and Layton were even slightly wrong, if the Japanese arrived at a different time or from a different direction, then the American carriers might miss them completely. And if the American carriers missed the Japanese fleet, then the Japanese would attack Midway unopposed and America's last hope to stop them would evaporate. But Nimitz didn't waffle. He didn't ask for more confirmation. He didn't hedge his bets. He accepted Layton's prediction. He committed the carriers to point luck. And he gave orders that the American task forces were to be in position to intercept the Japanese at 175 miles, bearing 325 degrees, on the morning of June 4th at approximately 0700 hours. Then Nimitz did something that almost nobody knows about. He went to his office. And he waited. June 4th, 1942. 0600 hours. The American task forces were positioned at Point Luck. The ships were at general quarters. Every man was at his battle station. The pilots were suited up and in their ready rooms, waiting for word that the Japanese had been sighted. But the Japanese hadn't been sighted yet. The American scouts were flying over the ocean, looking for any sign of the Japanese fleet. Flying in grid patterns, searching. Hoping. Praying. At 0703 hours, a radio call came in. A scout pilot radioed, "Enemy fleet sighted." The location, 175 miles from Midway. The bearing, 325 degrees. The time is 0703 hours. 3 minutes later than Layton's prediction. Layton had said 0700. The Japanese appeared at 0703. 3 minutes. That's all. When Nimitz heard the report, he turned to Layton and smiled. And Nimitz said, "Well, you were only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles out." Actually, the calculation was 5 minutes off on time, 0700 vs 0703. 5 degrees off on bearing, 325 degrees vs 320 degrees. 5 miles off on distance, 175 miles vs 180 miles. It became legend in the Navy: 5 minutes, 5 degrees, 5 miles. But that's not the point. The point is this: Rochefort and Layton had predicted not just the location of the Japanese fleet, but the exact time and bearing to within a margin that was almost impossibly small. And Nimitz had trusted that prediction. Nimitz had committed his 3 carriers to a battle based on decoded enemy messages that Washington had doubted. Based on intelligence that was so specific it seemed almost absurd. Based on a prediction that could have been completely wrong. And it turned out to be almost exactly right. The American carriers launched their aircraft. The American pilots attacked the Japanese carriers. In a battle that lasted less than 24 hours, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. Hundreds of experienced Japanese pilots were killed. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility was shattered. And the entire trajectory of the Pacific War was reversed. Before June 4, 1942, Japan was winning. Japan was on offense. Japan was choosing where to fight and when. After June 4, everything changed. America was on offense. America was choosing where to fight. America was dictating the pace. And it started with one decision: Nimitz's decision to believe Rochefort and Layton and commit his fleet to Point Luck. But the Battle of Midway was only the first of 3 decisions that Nimitz would make that changed the war. The second decision came at the Battle of the Coral Sea. 2 weeks before Midway, in May 1942, American and Japanese carrier forces clashed in the Coral Sea, an area of ocean between Australia and the Solomon Islands. The battle was confused. Both sides took heavy damage. Both sides had carriers hit. Both sides lost pilots. On the surface, it looked like a draw. Both sides claiming victory. Both sides having lost valuable assets. But what Nimitz understood, what the decoded intelligence told him, was that the Coral Sea battle had prevented Japan from taking Port Moresby. Port Moresby was a strategic base. If Japan controlled it, they could cut off Australia from American support. They could consolidate control over the South Pacific. But because of the Coral Sea battle, Port Moresby remained in American hands. Some commanders would have seen the Coral Sea as a loss or a draw. A tactical stalemate. But Nimitz saw it as a strategic victory. He understood the future consequences of the battle. He understood what it meant for the long-term war effort. That was Decision 2. Decision 3 came in late 1942, when Nimitz faced a strategic problem that was even more consequential. Nimitz knew that America would have to advance across the Pacific toward Japan. Island by island. Eventually reaching the Japanese homeland. The obvious approach was to attack every island. Fight for every piece of territory. Use attrition to eventually overwhelm the Japanese. It would be slow. It would be costly. But it would work eventually. But Nimitz understood something different. He understood that if you had intelligence, if you knew where Japanese forces were concentrated, where they were weak, where they had limited supplies, you could move faster. You could skip over heavily fortified islands and hit the weak ones instead. You could isolate the fortified islands from resupply. You could starve them into submission while you moved past them toward Japan. Nimitz proposed what became known as the island hopping strategy. Skip over the strongly defended islands. Land on the weak ones. Build airfields. Supply bases. Move forward. Island by island. Toward Japan. It was a doctrine that was built on the same principle as Midway, superior information plus the nerve to act on it. Because island hopping required trusting that the Japanese forces you left behind wouldn't somehow break out and destroy your supply lines. It required taking risks that other commanders wouldn't accept. It required betting that your intelligence was good enough to tell you which islands to skip and which to attack. Nimitz took those risks. And island hopping became the strategy that won the Pacific War. Here's what almost nobody understands about Admiral Nimitz. His genius wasn't tactical. It wasn't about being smarter than Japanese admirals in the heat of battle. It wasn't about innovative combat tactics or brilliant maneuvers. His genius was organizational. It was institutional. Nimitz had something that most commanders didn't have. He had the authority to believe intelligence that others doubted. He had the organizational position to commit entire carrier task forces to a battle based on decoded enemy messages. He had the institutional trust to take calculated risks that would have gotten most commanders court-martialed. And he had something else. He understood that intelligence isn't useful unless you act on it decisively. The Japanese had intelligence operations too. They had code breakers. They had analysts. They had spies and scouts and reports. But the Japanese didn't trust their intelligence the way Nimitz trusted his. And when Japanese intelligence officers flagged concerns, when they warned about American movements, the Japanese command structure was too rigid to act on those warnings. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carriers at Midway, actually received warnings that the Americans might be in the area. His own intelligence officers flagged concerns. A message came from headquarters in Tokyo suggesting that the Americans might know about the operation. But Nagumo was constrained by Japanese naval doctrine. He was constrained by hierarchical command structure. He was constrained by an institutional resistance to changing course once a plan was set in motion. He didn't act on the warnings. He didn't break formation. He didn't prepare a defense. He didn't position his ships defensively. He assumed his command structure was secure. He assumed his intelligence was accurate. He assumed nothing would go wrong. And when the American aircraft appeared over the horizon, he had no defense. Nimitz, by contrast, didn't just receive intelligence. He reorganized his entire fleet around it. Rochefort and Leighton gave him information. Nimitz gave that information meaning by committing his entire fleet to acting on it. And that's the real story. It's not about Nimitz being a genius tactician. It's about Nimitz being a leader who understood that the most important military advantage isn't firepower or speed or armor. It's information advantage. And more importantly, it's the institutional trust to act on that information decisively. This story has consequences that echo all the way to today. The modern US Navy operates under a doctrine called distributed lethality. The idea behind distributed lethality is that sensors and shooters are networked together. Information flows instantly from one ship to another. One commander sees the same tactical picture as every other commander. It's a doctrine that's built on the assumption that information can be trusted. That sensors are accurate. That networked commands can move decisively based on shared information. But distributed lethality only works if the organizational structure trusts the information. If the information is believed. If the command structure is willing to act on it decisively. The Japanese in 1942 had sensors. They had scouts. They had float planes that could detect the American fleet. They had radio operators. They had intelligence officers. What they didn't have was trust. They didn't have an organizational structure that could move decisively based on intelligence reports. When scouts reported seeing American ships, the information had to travel from the scout aircraft to the cruiser carrying them, then via radio to the flagship, then up the chain of command. By the time the information reached Admiral Nimitz, it had been delayed by the communication process. And by the time Nimitz made a decision, it was too late. Nimitz, by contrast, had built an organization where intelligence was trusted. Where code breakers had direct access to the commander. Where unconventional tactics were considered if intelligence supported them. When Rochefort said, "AF is Midway," Leighton believed him. When Leighton presented the intelligence to Nimitz, Nimitz believed him. And when Nimitz committed the carriers to Point Luck, he committed based on that intelligence. The communication chain was shorter. The trust was higher. The action was faster. The American advantage at Midway was only partially about having better pilots or better ships or better tactics. Most of it was about having a command structure that could move faster, trust better, and execute more decisively than the other side. For Japanese aircraft carriers sank at Midway because Nimitz positioned his task force in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Nimitz positioned his task force in exactly the right place at exactly the right time because he trusted decoded enemy messages. And he was willing to trust them when Washington officials and senior Navy leadership said he was gambling with impossible odds. That's not luck. That's not brilliance in a single moment. That's superior organizational architecture. And that organizational architecture became the model for every major American strategic success in the Pacific War after June 4, 1942. Let's zoom out for a moment and understand what this story really means. At the tactical level, the Battle of Midway was decided by brave American pilots who flew their aircraft into overwhelming enemy fire. Many of them died. Many of them were killed in action or lost at sea. Their sacrifice mattered. Their courage mattered. Their willingness to fly into danger mattered. But the battle was decided before those pilots were even in the air. The battle was decided in a basement at Pearl Harbor when Rochefort's team broke the Japanese code. The battle was decided when Rochefort and Leighton confirmed that AF was Midway. The battle was decided when Nimitz looked at that intelligence and chose to believe it. The battle was decided when Nimitz chose to reorganize his entire fleet based on that intelligence. At the operational level, Midway prevented Japan from consolidating control over the Pacific. It halted the Japanese offensive. It forced Japan onto the defensive for the first time. Before Midway, the Japanese Navy was making decisions about where to fight. The Japanese Navy was choosing when to attack. After Midway, the American Navy was making those decisions. The American Navy was choosing when to attack. That shift in initiative changed everything. At the strategic level, Midway was the beginning of the end for Japan. It marked the point at which Japan's expansion would be reversed. It marked the beginning of the American advance across the Pacific. The Japanese Empire would continue to fight for 3 more years. But after Midway, there was no path to Japanese victory. There was only the question of how long it would take for America to defeat them. All of that started with one decision, Nimitz's decision to believe the code breakers. There's a lesson embedded in this story that applies far beyond World War II. There are 2 ways an organization can respond to intelligence. The first way is bureaucratic. Intelligence flows through channels. It gets validated. It gets cross-checked. It gets approved by multiple layers of authority. By the time intelligence reaches the person who makes the decision, it has been filtered through so many bureaucratic layers that by the time it's approved, the situation has changed. The second way is trusting. Intelligence flows directly from the source to the decision maker. The decision maker evaluates the intelligence. The decision maker makes a rapid decision. The decision maker acts immediately. The Japanese military in World War II operated mostly through the first way, bureaucratic, hierarchical, layered. Nimitz chose to operate through the second way, direct, trusting, rapid. And in a war where information advantage is decisive, the second way wins. This is why Nimitz won at Midway. Not because he was smarter than Nagumo. Not because his pilots were braver. Not because American ships were better. But because his organization could move faster. Could trust better. Could act more decisively. But there's another element to this story that's equally important. Rochefort and Leighton were friends. They trusted each other. They had studied together. They understood each other's thinking. When Rochefort came to Leighton with the intelligence, Leighton believed him immediately. Not because Rochefort was an authority figure, but because Leighton knew Rochefort. Leighton understood how Rochefort thought. Leighton could evaluate the intelligence in the context of understanding the man presenting it. This is one of the reasons why the interwar Navy's program of sending officers to study in Japan was so valuable. Both Rochefort and Leighton had spent years in Japan studying the language and culture. They understood Japanese thinking. They understood Japanese psychology. They understood how Japanese military organizations worked. This gave them an intuitive sense of what was plausible and what wasn't. When they analyzed the decoded Japanese messages, they weren't just reading text. They were understanding the context. They were understanding the Japanese strategic thinking. They were understanding what made sense given what they knew about Japanese military strategy. This is what gave them the confidence to say AF is Midway with such conviction. And this is what made Nimitz willing to trust them. Nimitz didn't have to be a cryptographer to understand that Rochefort was trustworthy. Nimitz knew that Leighton believed Rochefort. Nimitz knew that both men had deep expertise in Japanese affairs. Nimitz knew that they were basing their conclusion not just on the decoded messages, but on a deep understanding of Japanese strategic thinking. And so Nimitz trusted them. We celebrate Midway as a brilliant victory. And it was. But it's important to understand what was at stake. If Nimitz had been wrong, if Rochefort's intelligence had been incorrect, If AF wasn't Midway, if the Japanese fleet had attacked somewhere else, then Nimitz would have sent his 3 remaining aircraft carriers to an empty ocean to wait for a Japanese fleet that never appeared. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet would be attacking somewhere else. Maybe Port Moresby. Maybe Hawaii. Maybe somewhere else entirely. And the American Navy would be out of position, uselessly burning fuel, waiting for an enemy that never came. By the time Nimitz could reposition his carriers, it would be too late. The Japanese would have achieved their objective. The American base they attacked would be destroyed. American ships would be sunk. And Nimitz would be blamed for gambling with the Navy's remaining carriers and losing. Nimitz would have been court-martialed. His career would have been destroyed. The American Navy's leadership would have been discredited. The war might have gone very differently. That's the stakes of Nimitz's decision. He wasn't just betting on his fleet. He was betting his career. He was betting the strategic future of the entire Pacific War. And he won. But it could have gone the other way. That's why it's called calculated risk, not just risk. Nimitz calculated the odds. He evaluated the intelligence. He understood what was at stake. And he made the decision to commit. In modern military operations, this same tension exists. A commander has intelligence about an enemy position. But the intelligence comes from a sensor that's not 100% reliable. Or from a human report that could be wrong. Or from an algorithm that's accurate 95% of the time but not always. Does the commander wait for more confirmation? Does the commander try to validate the intelligence through multiple sources? Or does the commander act immediately based on the intelligence available? In most modern military doctrine, the answer is act immediately. Because the cost of waiting is often higher than the cost of acting on incomplete information. The side that can move fastest, can trust its intelligence fastest, and can act fastest has a significant advantage. This is what Nimitz understood in 1942. And this is what the modern US military has incorporated into its doctrine. The advantage goes to the side that can process information fastest, that can trust that information, and that can act decisively based on it. Nimitz gave the American Navy that advantage. And that advantage proved decisive. After Midway, the American Navy operated under a different strategic doctrine. The island-hopping strategy that Nimitz implemented was based on the same principle, superior information plus willingness to act on it decisively. American intelligence officers would identify which Japanese-held islands were strongly defended and which were weakly held. American commanders would decide to skip the strongly defended islands and attack the weak ones instead. This strategy was controversial. Some commanders thought it was too risky to leave Japanese forces behind American lines. But Nimitz had the institutional authority to implement it. And it worked. Island hopping became the strategy that won the Pacific War. It allowed the American Navy to advance across the Pacific faster than Japan could respond. It allowed the American Navy to build supply bases and airfields on captured islands. It allowed the American Navy to consolidate control over the Pacific while systematically defeating Japanese forces. Island hopping was built on the same principle as Midway: trust the intelligence, act decisively, move fast. It's worth noting that Rochefort and Layton didn't work alone. Station HYPO was a team effort. It involved cryptographers, linguists, mathematicians, and intelligence analysts. Many of them worked under intense pressure for years. Some of them broke their health from the strain. Some of them didn't survive the war. But they gave the American Navy an advantage that proved decisive. After the war, the US Navy recognized the importance of this intelligence apparatus. The modern National Security Agency, NSA, traces its origins back to groups like Station HYPO. The principle that Rochefort and Leighton demonstrated, that intelligence organizations need direct access to decision makers, that information needs to be processed rapidly, that decisions need to be made on incomplete but best available intelligence, these principles shaped how American intelligence organizations operate today. After the war, Rochefort's contribution to American victory was largely forgotten. He was sidelined. He was given less important assignments. He didn't receive the recognition he deserved. It wasn't until decades later, after historians began to research the Battle of Midway in detail, that Rochefort's true contribution was understood. He was eventually recognized as one of the most important intelligence officers in American naval history. He died in 1976, having finally received the recognition he deserved. But for many years after the war, the man who gave America the intelligence advantage at Midway was largely forgotten. This is a pattern that often happens with intelligence officers. The work they do is classified. The methods are secret. Even when they succeed, the success can't be fully publicized because publicizing it would compromise the methods. So intelligence officers often work in obscurity, knowing that their work is crucial but not being able to tell anyone about it. Rochefort understood this. He wasn't motivated by fame or recognition. He was motivated by the knowledge that his work mattered. That his team's ability to break the Japanese code gave America the edge it needed to win. That was enough for him. After Midway, the war in the Pacific was essentially decided. Japan would fight for 3 more years. Japan would inflict tremendous casualties. Japan would refuse to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. But after Midway, there was no scenario in which Japan could win. Japan could not replace the carriers it lost. Japan could not replace the pilots it lost. Japan could not replace the industrial capacity needed to sustain a war against a nation with America's resources. The Japanese Navy, which had been dominant in the Pacific, would steadily decline as the war progressed. By 1944, the Japanese Navy was unable to challenge American naval power. By 1945, the Japanese Navy was essentially destroyed. And all of this traced back to Midway. All of this traced back to Nimitz's decision to believe Rochefort and commit his carriers to Point Luck. Here's what the story of Admiral Nimitz and the Battle of Midway really teaches us. Military victory is rarely determined by a single factor. It's rarely determined by who has the better ships or the braver pilots or the more experienced commanders. It's often determined by who can process information faster, who can trust that information, and who can act decisively on it. Nimitz had those qualities. He had access to Rochefort's code-breaking intelligence. He trusted that intelligence even when others doubted it. He acted decisively based on that intelligence. And that combination, information advantage plus organizational trust plus decisive action, proved decisive. The Battle of Midway wasn't decided in the air between the American and Japanese carriers. It was decided in a basement at Pearl Harbor where Rochefort's team broke the Japanese code. It was decided when Nimitz chose to believe Rochefort. It was decided when Nimitz committed his carriers to Point Luck. Those decisions made the pilots' bravery possible. Those decisions positioned the American fleet in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And that's why Nimitz's name is remembered in military history. Not because he was a tactical genius, but because he understood that information advantage is the foundation of military power. And he had the organizational authority and personal courage to act on that advantage decisively. When the sun rose on June 5, 1942, the Pacific War had fundamentally changed. For Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Hundreds of experienced Japanese pilots were dead. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility had been shattered. And the entire trajectory of the war had been reversed. But none of that would have happened if Admiral Chester Nimitz had made a different choice. If he had waited for more confirmation from Washington. If he had moved his carriers somewhere else. If he had doubted the code breakers. One decision. One commitment to acting on intelligence that others didn't trust. That's what changed everything. And 80 years later, when military strategists talk about the importance of intelligence in warfare, when intelligence professionals talk about the importance of being trusted by command, when naval leaders talk about networked warfare and distributed lethality, they're all talking about principles that Nimitz demonstrated at Midway. Not the battle itself. The decision before the battle. The moment Nimitz knew. The moment he trusted that knowledge. The moment he acted. If you want to understand how the Pacific War was really won, if you want to understand how intelligence determines military outcomes, if you want to understand how leaders make decisions under extreme uncertainty, you need to study the Battle of Midway. And more importantly, you need to understand Admiral Chester Nimitz. Because Nimitz didn't just win a battle. He demonstrated a principle that's still being taught in military academies today: the commander who can trust his intelligence, who can make decisions rapidly, and who can act decisively will defeat the commander who hesitates. Subscribe to this channel if you want more deep dive analysis of military history, strategic decision making, and how the decisions of individuals changed the course of history. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And tell me in the comments, what aspect of this story surprised you the most? Was it the intelligence breakthrough? Was it Nimitz's willingness to gamble? Was it the precision of Layton's prediction? Let me know in the comments below.